This video is an introduction to medieval literature and Renaissance literature in the British literary movements. We have three goals for this video. The first is to understand the important themes and genres of British medieval literature that comes right after Anglo-Saxon literature and Beowulf. Then we're going to talk about the Renaissance as a historical period on its own, and then we'll jump into understanding a little bit about the literature that actually came out of that Renaissance period. I want to first look briefly at a timeline. So we have been working on Beowulf, which is right here, and we said that it was part of the Anglo-Saxon period. Even though that's not in this image, I'm going to keep Beowulf itself as part of Anglo-Saxon literature and say that right around here is where I want the medieval period to start. Some of the big authors were Geoffrey Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales, if you've heard of it. And so we're gonna say that the medieval period is going to be after the Anglo-Saxons, and then we're going to look here at the Renaissance. Look at our big heavy hitter for the Renaissance, William Shakespeare. So he fits right in these new genres that we're looking at. Looking now specifically at medieval literature, the years we're going to say were about 1066 to 1500. So that would be 11th century to the late 15th century. And when we think of important themes, you might think of movies you've seen like The Knight's Tale or Princess Bride. Big themes for the medieval period were the ideas of honor and chivalry and how should a knight address a lady of the court. So we're talking about a lot of like princes and princesses and knights and ladies. A lot of romances between knights and ladies of the court. You might think of the movie Camelot or The Sword and the Stone, I think, is an old Disney movie that I'm thinking about. But you'll be picturing like knights and ladies. And the third theme to think about is the focus on religion and spreading the Christian religion. You'll remember from the Edict of Milan the idea that we could spread Christianity everywhere. It was no longer outlawed. And we had the Anglo-Saxons who took on a lot of Christianity that they learned from these monks and these missionaries. So that idea continues throughout medieval literature. And in addition to ideas about romances between knights and ladies, we still also have a lot of Christian texts that are deeply rooted in the Bible and Jesus' teachings. For genres, we have morality plays. These are plays that were intended to instruct the masses in moral codes and expectations. A lot of the masses of people still couldn't read, so they couldn't necessarily sit down and read a book or read a story. So they would watch these plays and the development of these plays, and those plays would promote some kind of a moral action or moral understanding or moral character. The second genre is folk ballads, and those are just short, simple songs telling a story, and notice that they're often spread through oral tradition. Just like Beowulf, you had masses that couldn't necessarily sit down and read. They couldn't read a book. So all of your stories, all of your moral expectations have to be spread in ways that can reach the masses, either through these easy songs or moral plays that show off some kind of a moral action. Last thing to know is that British medieval literature was mostly written in Middle English, what we do have written down. We looked maybe at this Lord's Prayer in Middle English, and you can see how the Lord's Prayer in Old English, we could barely read at all. But now these words at least look familiar. They might have different spellings, but for the most part, this is what we would be able to read. Now, we aren't actually reading any British medieval literature. We're just using it as a stepping stone between the Anglo-Saxons and medieval literature that we're going to be, Renaissance literature that we're going to be reading with Shakespeare. So this is just for your knowledge and to add to your timeline. Now we're on to part 2. We're talking about the British Renaissance. The first thing to remember is that the Renaissance means a rebirth. And we had things like the plague going on, all of these people, millions of people dying. And once we finally learned, okay, we can quarantine them and then life can go on, we had this rebirth of living. There was all of a sudden time to farm again and time to create art and time to invent things and think about who we are as people. And focusing on some of these inventions, we have two that are really important to us. One is the invention of the printing press. This makes literature available to the masses and spreads literacy throughout Europe. More people can get a hold of books, and more people are reading them, and more people are reading stories and reading poems. The church services were in people's vernacular. That is just their everyday speech. It was written not in Latin or a language that a lot of people couldn't understand, but in words that they could understand. So you have this kind of rebirth of the human experience of reading and a rebirth of the human experience connecting with God. Now that I can understand the church service, I don't necessarily need someone to be interpreting for me. I can have a relationship with God on my own. The second really important discovery for us is the telescope and the microscope. And if you think about it, all of a sudden we could see things that were so enormous they were originally beyond our comprehension, or so minute, like little organisms in our water, that we didn't even know they existed. So think about what that meant to society. All of a sudden, you could see these things and they were accessible to humans. They were accessible to our experience in everyday life to just look at a microscope or on a telescope. And much more questioning that came out of that, right? Who are we? What are we made of? Where do we come from? Do we need to go through a church official, or could I look at the moon by myself and not need this church official to mediate it for me? So the way we sum it up now is that the Renaissance is about humanism, and that is a rebirth in the way that we look and think about ourselves as humans, of focus not on uber religious thinking that you saw for the Anglo-Saxons and that you saw for the medieval period, but focusing on human life on Earth. And what does that mean to be a human, and what can we say academically about that experience? With that questioning comes a lot of ideas about what it means to be a human and to have all the emotions that we have. So what is guilt? How do we evaluate forgiveness? Can you challenge death? Is there such thing as immortality? These are questions that hadn't been explored in a really focused way like they were in the Renaissance. So here's what becomes really important to us studying literature. You have poets and playwrights and artists that are questioning and daydreaming and ultimately striving for a better understanding of humanity and our world. So writing plays or writing poems that explore what it means to be human and what are really human emotions, and is it okay to have really human emotions? Getting into Renaissance literature specifically, our years are going to be 1485 to the 1700s, so like the late 15th century to the late 17th century or the late 1600s. For our themes, they're very much grounded in humanity and in our flawed personas. We're going to look at a lot about love, a lot about just human emotions in general, or human passions. We'll look at human potential. How far can a human go? Is a human at all close to a god or a divine being? And just overall documenting the human experience on Earth. What's it like to fall in love? What's it like to have to forgive someone? What is it like to have to take care of a family and also deal with revenge or whatever else you may be going through? We have 3 different genres that we'll pay close attention to in this unit. The first is going to be metaphysical poetry, and that is using unusual similes and metaphors in a poem. One example is like the human soul being like a drop of dew, or the human soul is like a flea, or something like that. Thinking about all of these weird things that you can compare to our humanity. Next is sonnets. I think maybe in the past you've probably looked at a couple Shakespearean sonnets. We'll look at some from Shakespeare and some outside of Shakespeare, and then drama in verse. So this is our heavy hitter for Shakespeare. Macbeth was written in verse, Julius Caesar and Romeo and Juliet and Othello. All of these things are written in verse, and so we'll look specifically at how that fits in with the Renaissance period and with Renaissance literature as we make our way through Macbeth. Finally, the language of the British Renaissance literature was modern English, and we have talked about this. Even though Shakespeare's writing might not necessarily make perfect sense to us after the first read, it still is technically modern English. You'll see that a lot of the spellings are at least similar enough that we can understand exactly what's going on. The order of words might be different, but ultimately, this is where our modern English that we speak today comes from. I think that's all I have for you for this round of this introduction. Be sure that you finish up your notes template, you submit it to Canvas, and I will see you soon.